Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the organizers as well. Thank you to the speakers before me as well. There's quite a lot of crossover, and I'm really especially grateful, Gareth, for the setup, because now I don't have to argue that capitalism is bad and we need to get rid of it. I can move on and do the thinking about transition. That's kind of the plan, or some way of thinking about transition. So I'm going to present some of the thinking that I've been doing with my colleagues and comrades Bertie Russell and Keir Milburn. So it's not just me doing this work, there's a collective, and I think it's really important to make that clear from the beginning. And I'm going to present some of the work we've been doing around thinking about revolutionary transitions, green transitions, especially around this organization that we call Public Commons Partnership, which kind of plays on these distinctions that we're talking about here today between the private, the public, and the commons. So I'm looking forward to talking about those three and how we can think about them. So for several years now, the three of us have been thinking about developing an organizational form and an instrument of transition that we call public common partnerships. At their simplest level, PCPs are an organizational form that tries to democratize control over the production, over assets, and over resources, and that puts workers, not just the workers who work in an industry, but also the community that they're a part of, in control of the surpluses that are generated from assets and resources. Don't worry. Okay. Now? Yeah, I'll keep going. Thank you very much. So the aim of PCPs, this public common partnership, is to set into motion what we call a self-expansion of the commons, which is a process of expanding spaces of worker control and deliberation so that they can contest capital's own immanent logics of self-expansion and accumulation that we've been talking about this morning, and which operate primarily, as we've heard, through exploitation, plunder, violence, and ecological destruction. So how can we expand a different system of our own reproduction outside of capital circuits of accumulation? That's kind of the thing I want to talk about and get us to think about. We've been thinking about PCPs, or public common partnerships, at various levels of abstraction. We've developed them as an abstract model of worker and community control, but we've also worked in concrete ways with communities. So we've been thinking with communities in London to push back against gentrification. We've been working on the Isle of Skye to push against industrialized salmon farming, to produce agroecological and aquaecological food systems. Where else? We've been working on pharmaceuticals, democratizing pharmaceutical control in France. And my work in particular is on agroecology and a transition away from conventional food and farming systems in England towards agroecological food systems in the UK and elsewhere. Okay, so that's kind of the background. But in any case, this kind of learning that we've been doing is culminating in this book that's going to be published next year. Get to do a little early plug, called Radical Abundance: How to Win a Green and Democratic Future. And that book does a few things. So first, we build on interest around the notion of radical abundance, spoken of by people like Jason Hickel and Kohei Sato in the kind of degrowth community, to propose that capitalism delivers what we call bullshit abundance and artificial scarcity. To secure a world of radical abundance for human and non-human life, we argue that we need to leave capitalism behind once and for all, and I think we've already heard why we need to do that this morning. Second, the book outlines what we call the invariant features of capitalism that must be abolished by a transition towards the commons. Third, we engage in a Gramscian conjunctural analysis, searching for spaces of opportunity to implement a revolutionary transition towards the commons in the here and now. Fourth, we introduce PCPs as a kind of conjunctural response to capital's current crisis tendencies. And then fifth, we show how PCPs are being implemented in three sectors: agriculture, urban planning, and pharmaceuticals. I'm explaining all of that up front to you as the backdrop for the talk. What I'm really using you for is a litmus test. So when you critique me, I can go back and just change the book so that I don't get the same critique later. So I'm going to follow the book's structure by moving from kind of an abstract discussion of capital's invariant features towards a conjunctural analysis, towards how we can intervene in that conjunctural analysis. That's the kind of structure I'm following. That method of approach is something that I think is really essential to theorizing and hopefully enacting a revolutionary transition. So as Marx explains in the Grundrisse, it's a process of ascending from the abstract to the concrete, The concrete, the problem of how to transition away from fossil fuels and industrialized agriculture, for instance, is for Marx only concrete because it is, as he puts it, the concentration of many determinations. So the need to decarbonize, say, our energy and food systems, we just need to do that, right? It's a brute empirical fact that we have to decarbonize, not now, but yesterday, ideally. But we don't know how to do that. We don't understand what's necessary until you look at the kind of invariant features of the system that is resisting that transition, and that's capitalism, right? So I start with the invariant features, and then we move through to the conjunctural features. So maybe we can discuss that method in the Q&A as well. Okay. So let's kind of start with a provocation, this idea of bullshit abundance, which we're borrowing in part from bullshit jobs from David Graeber. We can talk about that in a bit. I'm not going to focus on that too much right now. But we'll begin with this provocation. Global capitalism has created a world defined by bullshit abundance, a world where we have too much of what we don't need, too much of what we don't need and too little of what we do. So to take some examples almost at random, as you listen to me speak, there are toxic microplastics coursing through the bloodstreams of every single person in this room. Every newborn child enters the world with microplastics in their systems, and microplastics are now considered a, quote, constituent part of every rain cloud and of every raindrop. We are, quite literally, if you like, submerged in and encompassed by a bullshit abundance of microplastics. Though it isn't often thought about in these terms, the world also suffers from a bullshit abundance of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Centuries of burning fossil fuels have increased carbon parts per million in the atmosphere from 280 prior to the Industrial Revolution to around 421 today. Because of these ever-increasing emissions, the agreement made in COP21 in Paris back in 2016 to keep global warming to 1.5°C above pre-industrial levels is dead. We live in a world after the collapse of the 1.5 target. On our current path, again, as we saw earlier, keeping warming to a catastrophic 2°C seems almost as fantastical. The fossil fuel industry, as many of us know, has been destroying the support systems for life on Earth as we know it since the 1950s. They have bullshitted us about the dangers of their industry, playing down its effects. Western governments have similarly known that they need to take immediate action on their emissions for over half a century, and yet the responses to the crisis have been constrained by the prioritization of bullshit abundance. Massive accumulations of wealth for the capitalist and political classes, and massive accumulations of atmospheric CO2 emissions at the expense of the conditions needed for human and non-human life as we know it. Then there's the bullshit abundance of low-quality, mass-produced commodities and foodstuffs. We are all familiar with the idea of planned obsolescence, the practice of intentionally designing products that break or that become quickly outdated to force consumers to buy more stuff. So from light bulbs to smartphones to fast fashion to kitchen appliances, manufacturers cut the lifetime of commodities short to guarantee maximum profits down the line. This practice causes chaos up and downstream from the consumer. So upstream, it means more and more material must be mined, grown, processed, and manufactured into consumables, placing pressure on planetary resources and requiring huge amounts of energy. Downstream, it results in a bullshit abundance of waste. Products that have unnecessarily rather come to the end of their lives languish in landfills because it costs more to recycle and repurpose them than it does to toss them aside where they contaminate soils and water systems. But not everybody has access to this bullshit abundance of consumables. Capitalism generates a bullshit abundance in one part of the world system by imposing artificial scarcity on another. The cheap consumables and cheap food that some of us have access to in the global north, or more accurately, in the imperial core, is only made possible by imposing various kinds of artificial scarcity on workers and ecosystems in the core's internal peripheries and peripheries in the global south. Through a process known as labor arbitration, multinational companies registered in the imperial core seek out subcontractors to employ labor with low wages and poor working conditions in the periphery. Keeping wages and welfare to a minimum in the periphery while limiting the international free movement of workers means commodities can be manufactured at a low enough price to be widely affordable in the core. This, in turn, maximizes profits for the world's capitalist classes. The political economist John Smith has shown how a process of labor arbitration is at work in everyday commodities, from coffee to clothing to smartphones, and how it has a deleterious effect on workers, usually racialized, usually women, and in the periphery and on ecosystems. For their part, the development scholars Utzer and Prabhat-Patnaik have shown how tropical foods and flowers are similarly produced through the superexploitation of land, seas, and labor in the periphery to ensure the global north has an abundance of tropical foodstuffs in and out of season, even as hunger and malnutrition increases among the very people growing our food. Another way to put this practice is to say that capital imposes scarcity of the means to survive and flourish on workers and communities in the periphery to generate a bullshit abundance of commodities in the core. This, though, doesn't secure a good life for everybody in the core. I'm not making the claim that everyone has it, good in the global north. As the so-called cost of living crisis rises, as secure, well-paid employment becomes harder to find, as affordable housing becomes harder to source, more and more workers in the core are experiencing an artificially imposed scarcity that generates a bullshit abundance of profits for energy companies, for landlords, for asset managers, and for shareholders. This polarization of bullshit abundance and artificial scarcity has dire social effects, but it also creates problems for the world's ecosystems. Toxic and polluting byproducts of manufacturing are routinely disposed of into water systems, soils, and the atmosphere. Under capitalism, the manufacture and disposal of byproducts associated with everything from solar panels to clothing to hamburgers to vegan sausages are leaked into water systems, dumped into landfills, released into the atmosphere, or otherwise improperly disposed of to reduce costs. These practices negatively affect biodiversity in critical ecosystems across the planet, creating an artificial scarcity of life where once there was a non-human abundance. This then, of course, loops back around and has social ramifications, as we know. We cannot get outside of our enmeshment in the web of life, as Jason Moore calls it. Okay, I don't have an EU image, but I do have an IPCC image. Yeah, you're okay. So because of these violent dialectics of bullshit abundance and artificial scarcity, everywhere we look, the world is undergoing a period of decisive social and ecological upheaval. Global heating, ecological deterioration, geopolitical conflagrations, zoonotic spillovers, artificial intelligence, the economic uncertainty all converge and compound one another to create this highly combustible political landscape that some have taken to calling things like the polycrisis. According to Ipsos's 2023 Global Trends Report, we inhabit what they call a new world disorder, characterized by unprecedented shocks and unpredictable disruptions. The International Panel on Climate Change's sixth assessment report, published in 2023, and widely referred to as their final warning on global heating, called for what they called a transition, quote, from incremental to transformational adaptation, before noting that such a transition was limited by various vested interests, by economic lock-ins, by institutional path dependencies, and cultures, norms, and belief systems. In other words, then, the world's largest independent body of climate specialists is calling for something like a revolutionary transformation in what the Hungarian Marxist philosopher István Mészáros calls humanity's metabolic exchange with non-human nature. In other words, just our exchanges, our relations with nature and between ourselves. Things, quite simply, cannot carry on as they are. A transition of some sort to somewhere is at once inevitable and already underway. So transition has become the kind of problem of our times. This is why we're talking about transitions here today. Arguably, as we've already heard this morning, sectors of capital have begin to set some kind of transition plan in motion. Vested capitalist and state interests kind of inclined towards pursuing incremental so-called green capitalist transitions, such as net zero pledges, carbon offsetting schemes, carbon sequestration projects, de-risking private capital that we'll come back to in a bit, and investment in the minerals, metals, and technologies needed for a so-called green capitalist economy. In what is often referred to as green growth, market-based mechanisms will supposedly facilitate what is called an orderly transition from fossil fuel-based economies to a renewable one, and in the process, lift the economy out of what has been called the Great Stagnation, this kind of moment where there doesn't seem to be any real growth in GDP across the global north. So to refer to this summer school's theme, this incrementalist theory of transition is what a transition organized for and by the private sector looks like. It has been widely and rightly criticized for perpetuating neo-colonial and imperialist divisions of labor, accelerating value transfers from the periphery to the core of the capitalist world system, withholding much-needed finance from the global south, and exposing racialized populations to death and dying. It is a recipe for what I've previously called a situation of eco-apartheid, where a select few are protected from the worst of ecological collapse and deterioration by putting the majority in harm's way. It is a continuation of the violent dialectics of bullshit abundance and artificial scarcity. Okay, I'm going to get out of the grim bit and try and move into some thinking about what we do about it. So critics of capital's metabolic control have not, however, advanced their thinking, I don't think, quite as far on transition or as quickly as the capitalists have. If you like, capital is ahead of us in this game of thinking about how to create a transition. For some years now, the problem of transition has receded from view or has been replaced by political strategies and visions for the future on the left that either deny the need for a transitional period at all, or that jump over the problem of transition to imagine a post-capitalist or a commons-based future. So despite their differences, proponents of a wide range of perspectives from prefigurative politics to things like communization theory have taken the former approach. Rather than transition presenting itself as an enduring, volatile, and reversible period between capital's metabolic control and something like a commons-based system, they propose immediate acts of living beyond or outside of capital in what are called the cracks of capital circuits of accumulation. It's this idea that we can just step away, find spaces that aren't capitalist in the present. Authors of visionary Green New Deals, degrowth economies, half-earth socialism, fully automated luxury communism, and more, these kinds of books I've got on the screen, take a slightly different approach. Here, the problem of transition is not always, but is quite often, skewed in favor of presenting desirable visions of the future that might galvanize a social base, a kind of utopian vision of where we can head to, right? But not an image of how we get there. And so this problem of how we go from where we are to where we need to be disappears from view in some of these books. And this is a thing that I find somewhat concerning when we need to be thinking so seriously about transition. Okay. So this is where the pursuit of something like radical abundance comes in. This is, I'm not going to go into detail about defining the concept. I want to focus on thinking about transition. But I'll give an indication by saying that it's a kind of negative image of bullshit abundance. Bullshit abundance is a world organized around the private accumulation of wealth at social and ecological expense. If something isn't profitable, it just doesn't happen. Because of this, bullshit abundance robs the vast majority of human life, the world's working classes, and non-human life of the possibility of surviving and flourishing. Radical abundance, in contrast, is about maximizing the capacity for human and non-human life to flourish. Through processes of democratic social and ecological planning, and through common ownership of the means of production, it aims to meet social and natural needs immediately, rather than mediating them through capitalist exchange value. Radical abundance, then, is about providing more of what we need and less of what we don't. That means, for example, more free time, more accessible housing and public services, more biodiverse landscapes, more control over our lives, communities, and environments, less polluted landscapes, fewer parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and so on. But to go from bullshit abundance to radical abundance still raises this problem of transition. It's not enough to describe what radical abundance is. We need conversations about how to chart our way towards it in the here and now. So this is the problem of transition that has to be tackled head-on. The problem with theorizing transition, though, is that it comes with its own challenges, right? It's a very, very difficult word to pin down and to conceptualize. Michael Labarovitz, for example, warned that the word transition risks introducing what he called more than a hint of teleology into our thinking and into our strategizing. Transition can imply a kind of frictionless passage from point A to point B without a vestige or a remainder. The presupposed victory of the new over the old, which reproduces this idea of a kind of ineluctable path of history that we move from feudalism to capitalism to some kind of post-capitalist society in a linear direction, right? We need to get outside of this linear notion of teleology if we're going to think, of a teleological linear notion of transition if we're going to think about it today. So the problem with this is that this rendering of transition, the contested, mutable, variegated, plural, and underdetermined character of historical capitalism's expansion and reproduction on a world scale disappears from view, as does the potential for transitions to reverse back or collapse into the old order they sought to depart. Such a mechanistic approach is a barrier to implementing a politics of transition because they obscure the concrete, messy, and contingent realities of struggling for a new metabolic order. They are also a problem because they do not actually accurately capture how actually existing revolutionary advances, those made, for example, whatever your views, people like Lenin, Mao, or anti-colonial figures like Sankara and Cabral, the way they made transitions and decolonial revolutions happen, it doesn't map onto this teleological notion of transition. So it doesn't understand how revolutions were actually made and unmade in practice. Okay, so it's around here that I kind of profess an admiration for Istvan Meszaros, who I think some people told me is read a bit more widely here than he is in the UK, where I'm from, where he's less commonly engaged with. But I'm going to take a bit of a dive into him in the next part of this lecture. So Meszaros is a challenging theorist to read, as much because of the length of his books. Beyond Capital is about 1,000 words, as it is for the lack of a good edit by his publishers. I'm told authoritatively that his publishers just gave up editing him because it was too much work. So they just were like, well, just have the book. But he is, I think, really important. So if you're interested in him, my advice is read Beyond Capital first, not anything else, but go to the back. Read the last kind of 4 chapters and then go back round. It'll make a lot more sense. Okay, so anyway, I think that book is essential for thinking about transition. So in there and elsewhere, he makes what I think is a really significant kind of contribution to thinking transition in a non-teleological way from a Marxist perspective. He roots his work in Marx's theory of value, in Capital's worldwide laws of motion, and I think importantly in lessons that he developed through conversations with Hugo Chavez and the Chavismo movement. So there's a conversation going on here with movements trying to enact something like a communal form, and you can see that reflected in the book. Meszaros' thought departs from a novel distinction between capital and capitalism. Put simply, Meszaros argues that one can depart from capitalism without departing from capital's metabolic control over production, reproduction, and our metabolic interactions with non-human nature. This is because capitalism is but one form that capital's metabolic control can take. As Meszaros explains, you can overthrow the capitalist, but the factory system remains, the division of labor remains, nothing has changed in the metabolic functions of society. Indeed, sooner or later, you find the need for reassigning those forms of control to personalities, and that's how the bureaucracy comes into existence. From this perspective, then, as he says, the overthrow of capitalism can hardly even scratch the surface of the problem, which is the complete eradication of capital from the social metabolic process. As these quotes perhaps imply, the Soviet Union serves as Meszaros' primary example of the distinction between capital and capitalism. At various moments in its existence, Meszaros argues, the Soviet Union succeeded, to a greater or lesser degree, in abolishing capitalist class relations, capitalist state forms, and the organization of production around surplus value, but it didn't succeed in dismantling the alienated character of capital's control over production, driven by the need to accumulate surplus labor. It substituted capitalism's economic extraction of surplus labor for its political extraction, is another way of putting this. So it's through the distinction between capital and capitalism that Meszaros' theory of transition comes into view. Overthrowing capitalism may indeed be part of a revolutionary transition, but it can't be the end. Capital itself must be superseded or transcended, as he puts it, in its entirety, which for Meszaros means, quote, the complete eradication of capital from the social metabolic process, including capital's divisions of labor, the alienation of workers from the means of production, hierarchical command structures, and the organization of production around economically or politically regulated surplus labor extraction. Meszaros' insistence that it's not enough to overthrow the capitalist state or expropriate the expropriators, as Marx put it, is what makes him so useful for our purposes for theorizing transition today, I think. These, for Meszaros, these acts of expropriation of the expropriators are only negative acts, which then must be followed up and accompanied by a positive act of building an alternative metabolic order, a different way of reproducing ourselves, if you like, that is democratically governed by the associated producers. So what such an alternative metabolic order would look like, how it would be governed, is necessarily open to, and is necessarily a kind of conjunctural question. Even so, Mesros tells us that it requires two things that are kind of invariant if you want to overthrow capitalism, right? One is the disalienation of producers from the means of production and the passing of metabolic control from the state to capital and society at large. That's the second, meaning that the world's wage and unwaged laboring classes democratically control their reproduction. Radical abundance therefore requires institutional forms that curtail or diminish capital's metabolic control and that facilitate the conscious and democratic social and ecological planning by what Marx called the associated producers. So that's kind of the invariant features of capital that needs to be overthrown, right? Yet knowing that these features, these invariant features, and knowing what they are, many of us in this room have read Marx. Like, this might not be very original to you. You're like, yep, I know that that's what needs to happen. The next step then is moving from that abstract level down to something more concrete, right? How do we get rid of capitalism in the here and now? And I think there are 3 points of strategic orientation that I'm going to develop that I think are useful, and then I'm going to move down another level to a kind of conjunctural intervention. So what I'll introduce now then are these kind of 3 notions of transition, 3 elements to pay attention to in transition that I've come to by the work that I do thinking about PCPs, and then at the end I'll come back to how they maybe work in public common partnerships. Okay. Number 1, the importance of contested reproduction. So transition, or revolution, is often mistakenly reduced to a moment of rupture. It's a week, a day, a minute, or a second when power seems to decisively change hands. So we might want to think of the signing of the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, the storming of Bastille in 1789, the storming of the Winter Palace in 1917, or Sankara's radio announcement on August 4th, 1983. Philosophers like Alain Badiou like to talk about the event with a capital E to signify these moments of rupture, of dramatic change. Jacques Rancière talks about the fleeting eruption of politics and things like this, right? You might be familiar with those. These figurations of revolution, in which one social order bursts forth from the carcass of another, fully formed, carries significant risks. Not only has it been harnessed by reactionary and conservative figures to question the sageness and feasibility of revolution, we need only think of that cliché allegation that revolutions always eat their young, but it has distorted leftist thought itself. An overemphasis on the symbolic and heroic moment in which power appears to transfer from one class to another underplays the messy, patient, and protracted realities of a transition. To properly theorize what it takes to establish a self-sustaining alternative metabolic order, as Mesros puts it, the idea of revolution as rupture has to take a backseat to thinking transition as an enduring struggle for supremacy between 2 systems, capital, private capital accumulation, and the commons. In his theorization of transition in terms of disorder, Alberto Toscano notes that too little attention has been paid to the problem of reproduction in revolutionary transition. And I agree with him on this front. So he says, how, he asks, can we reproduce ourselves outside of capital circuits while capital persists and resists us? Toscano rightly looks to the Black Panther Party and its survival programs as a limited but successful example, but then somewhat oddly turns to Balabar for the conceptual armature to theorize reproduction in transition. Economic forms, the subordination of these forms to the new form, and their gradual elimination. Revolutionary transition is thus an enduring process of replacing capital's metabolic control over our collective lives with our collective reproduction through democratically planned systems and organizations and institutions. This isn't to endorse some kind of organicist notion of change or transition or revolution that eschews the importance of class conflict or that forecloses contestation over the state. Neither is it to endorse a theory of transition that seeks to create supposedly non-capitalist social formations within capital's kind of fissures and its cracks. It is instead to place the immediate emphasis on acting within our existing capacities and constraints to diminish capital's metabolic control, to establish spaces of democratic planning and production by the associated producers, and then to insulate those spaces to protect them from capital's disciplinary effects like rent or interest rates or wage relations. So this is an active process, if you like, of dismantling capital's metabolic control and of building a commons-based alternative order. The kind of wager here is that if these commoning projects can connect and can amplify one another, it's feasible to weaken capital's metabolic control, tipping the balance of forces in favor of the commons, while preparing for what would, in all likelihood, be some kind of violent confrontation with the forces opposed to a transition towards the commons. Okay, second feature. The second feature in creating is just simply creating new political subjects. So if you've been involved in protests, in rallies, in riots, in strikes, or occupations, you will know that the people who engage in struggle are transformed by the struggles that they engage in. Social struggles, the practice of organizing collectively, changes the way you think. It changes your consciousness. And it changes your capacities to act, because you act as a collective instead of as an individual, in and through a struggle, right? To try and realize something like radical abundance, or whatever else you want to call it. Going back to Laborovitz shows how capital's metabolic control, to sustain, to perpetuate itself, it has to produce not just commodities, but it also has to produce workers who look upon capital, as if it's just natural, right? Nothing else could exist. The only thing that's possible is capitalism, and you just look upon it as like, yep, that's an ineradicable fact of life. So it follows that a transition has to find institutions, collectives, different kinds of spaces to enable a new kind of subjectivity or consciousness to emerge that can look upon the commons as if it is natural, right? As if nothing else is possible. This is the most desirable way. Capitalism is insane. We need something that's collective democratic planning, right? This is kind of the function, traditionally, of revolutionary parties. It's the function served by communes. It's the function served by militant trade unions, not all trade unions, of course. And as we'll see later, it's sort of the function we hope to form through public common partnerships. Sorry, yeah, uneven temporalities, okay. So the third, final one, is uneven transition, the unevenness of transition. There are, I think, three ways that temporalities of transition are conventionally thought about in people thinking about environmental politics. The first is just a straightforward climate doomism. There's nothing to be done. It's already too late. It's over. It's not survival pending revolution, as the Panthers put it, but it's just survival, plain and simple, right? We just have to cling on and hope for the best. The second is some version of teleological thought, the idea that something like the good ship of capital will eventually tear its hull on the rocks of its own contradictions. Things just have to keep getting worse. When the contradictions amplify far enough, the working class, who are the grave diggers of capital, will just seize control. Problem solved, socialism, right? This kind of teleological notion. And then the third of these is the idea that yeah, okay, well, I mean, yeah, you know where that idea comes. The third of these are kind of messianism, right? So the future is kind of radically open, that it's unknowable, that history moves and fits and starts and leaps and reversals. And so we have to kind of hold out hope and keep on fighting for the revolution to come, to borrow Derrida's term. This idea is kind of theological in itself. Just have hope, right? This imposition, and then somehow that will create change. Of these three these ideas of temporality, I think the first two are just straightforwardly unserious propositions. Doomism is self-fulfilling. If you think the world's going to end, you don't do anything to change it, of course, you know, things are going to get worse. That seems straightforward. Teleology is just a secular theology. It's waiting for the world to do what it should be doing for you. And then the third, I think, is kind of right to believe, as Daniel Bensaid puts it, that the strategic time of politics is not homogeneous and empty. It's instead defined by leaps, ruptures, and reversals, right? The time doesn't move in a linear fashion. There's that apocryphal saying from Lenin. He didn't actually say it, but the idea, you know, that there are months where days happen, days where weeks. That idea that time is kind of moves in a non-linear way. So if we want to think about transition, I think we need to think about them as non-linear things. Transition, in other words, is necessarily defined by openness, contingency, and provisionality. Its speed and its direction are determined by the balance of class struggle. Critically, this means that revolutionary advances are also reversible, something that Istvan Mesmeros will go on and on about because of the experience of the Soviet Union. As Mesmeros warns in a scenario of contested reproduction, capital's metabolic control can indeed be abolished in a limited historical setting, but it doesn't guarantee that the capitalism won't be restored elsewhere. So attention to the uneven temporal nature of transition, to spaces of conjunctural possibility, is essential. we're used to thinking about revolutions or social movements taking place in space, right? So we think of the square, we might think of the palace, or we might think of the workshop. But they also take place in the unevenness of time, and we need to think about those temporalities of transition. Okay. Hopefully you're with me. That's a lot of theory. I know I've done theory, heavy theory. I'm going to go down a level of abstraction for what I've got left and start thinking about conjunctures and conjunctural analyses. To do that, I have to get more specific, right? That's the nature of them. So I'm going to be talking about the UK primarily, the US a little bit, but I'm interested to hear about your experiences, where you're from, whether the analysis I'm going to give now makes any sense in different contexts. Okay. So to think about conjunctural analyses, right? We need to start thinking about what strategic opportunities are open to us today. This is the kind of question that conjunctural analysis is organized by. How can we maximize the leverage that we can possibly have given the limited forces that we have on the left, given the weak position that we're in? When you start asking that kind of question, I think you need what Gramsci, Stuart Hall, and others have called a conjunctural analysis. The term has rightly received extensive discussion in recent years. I'm not going to try and give an extensive definition of it right now. If you're interested in the concept, I think Gillian Hart's recent work is really good on this. Obviously, Gramsci, Stuart Hall, Jamie Peck has a good essay on conjunctural analysis and green transitions as well. So for now, it's just enough to say that there are many kind of conjunctural analyses available to us, and the conjunctural analyses necessarily change depending on where you're situated within global's capital order. But for the sake of thinking about green transitions in the imperial core, in the book Radical Abundance, we turn to the rise of active industrial strategies and the concurrent emergence of what Daniela Gabor has called the de-risking state, which we believe marks a sea change in how imperial powers are governing transition and how they're thinking about green transitions. So it's through de-risking that we think imperial powers are pursuing their so-called green transition, and through the logic of de-risking, that we think there's possibly a window of opportunity to pursue a revolutionary transition towards the commons. And it's that argument that I'm going to try and unpack in the time I have left before the Q&A. So in essence, the de-risking state functions by absorbing some of the financial risks of investment through public spending or liabilities to incentivize private capital to invest where it otherwise might not want to. As a strategy of transition, it entails the public sector, the state, our taxes, absorbing some of the risk of the transition so that private capital can reap the rewards. This is considered necessary by the state because only the private sector, it's argued, has the knowledge and the capacity to build out the green energy system, for example, or green agricultural sector. But in truth, it's just a means to socialize the risks of transition while privatizing the rewards of wealth profits. It's kind of a logic of bullshit abundance all over again. Evidence that we're witnessing a shift towards a macroeconomic policy of industrial strategy and de-risking has recently come from debates around the Biden administration, in particular in the US. So the former director of the National Economic Council, Brian Deese, for example, recently argued that it is now clear that the private market on its own and private actors operating to maximize their own utility will end up underinvesting in areas of the economy that have strategic and economic significance. This is major because it's a political figure, a very powerful political figure in the US, just saying the free market will not solve this problem on its own. The state has to step in. We have to de-risk the energy transition. A similar shift is also happening in the UK. So this is a quote from Rachel Reeves. She's the shadow chancellor for the next 3 days, and then she's probably going to be the chancellor of the Exchequer when Labour come into power in the UK. But there's a similar shift here. So the Labour Party, our government in waiting, has established or is establishing what it calls a National Wealth Fund and a British Infrastructure Council that's going to oversee a wave of de-risking of private investment in green energy and infrastructure. The government will support this by using public money to fund 25% of a given initiative. So to give you a sense of who this policy benefits, it can seem like maybe a good idea on paper if the private sector won't go into somewhere, give it a push. It's organizing this alongside Lloyds, HSBC, Santander, Phoenix, Fidelity, and the US firm BlackRock. So it's a recipe for the continuation of bullshit abundance, and it's a who's who of bullshit merchants that are sitting on the advisory council of these things. Nevertheless, this de-risking agenda has important consequences, I think, for those of us on the left. If the state can decide to de-risk private capital accumulation, why can't it de-risk a transition towards the commons? The newfound willingness of imperial states to intervene through grand macroeconomic policy, like Biden's Inflation Reduction Act or Labour's National Wealth Fund, exposes the importance of the fact that political decisions are being made here. The idea that elected governments are just responding to market signals and that they don't create markets or that they can't shape the direction of capital flows is now gossamer thin. We increasingly see states in the imperial court openly making decisions about what to de-risk, which means that we know they could make different ones, right? Or rather, they could be forced through mass working class mobilization and the evidencing of alternative forms of ownership and transition to make different decisions. One or two passages in the Labour Manifesto, just to show you the kind of Gramscian conjunctural analysis and the way we use this in our work. One or two passages in the manifesto kind of point in that direction. It's not all just BlackRock and Lloyds. There are some people still in Labour, though they've purged many of the left. There are still some who care about things like cooperatives and alternative forms of left ownership. And those occasional references are things that workers function as rhetorical hooks for us. So when we do our work with communities, organizing for democratic control, we can point to Labour councillors and say, well, wait a second, your manifesto, you pledged this, right? It's some kind of a rhetorical hook. So we try and use these moments to try and think about transition and to de-risk this transition towards the commons. Okay. Still with me. I'm going to get even more specific now. I'm going to start talking about public common partnerships, which means I have to get, it's a new space for me. I grew up in organizing like Occupy movement. I grew up in kind of opposed to kind of policy, put it that way, right? And now there's a need, I think, to intervene in kind of leftist policy spaces that can mobilize or help social forces organize and make and apply pressure onto states. And so Abdundance, the organization I've helped set up, part of our work is to create these models that might be of use to social movements that they can point to and be inspired by. So if you're in movements, please be as critical as you want of these. Come at me, I'm curious to see what you say. So PCPs, or public common partnerships, are a kind of strategic wager. They are a wager into this de-risking conjuncture. I'm not claiming that they're the only possible way of intervening into this de-risking state moment. I'm not even trying to say that they're the best way. They are, I think, interesting and potentially fruitful. They're having some purchase in various places across the UK. And they work as a way to politicize the de-risking of private capital while pushing the debate in the left past straightforward demands, and this is important, for just nationalization of industry and utilities. We know that what can be nationalized, what can be owned by the state, can just as easily be denationalized once again when it becomes profitable, which means that that's just another way of de-risking, right, for private capital. We'll take on the risk, we'll absorb making it function again, and then we'll give it back again to the private sector. We've taken all that risk on, now make your money, right? So giving workers direct democratic control, on the other hand, hopefully, workers won't want to give it back. That's the wager. Once you know you have power, once you know you can make your own democratic decisions, you won't want to give that back to the private sector. Okay, so public common partnerships are an institutional form that democratizes the management and ownership of an asset or a resource. This can be anything from a farm, to a woodland, to an energy company, to a high street, to a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant. The goal is to empower workers and their communities to democratically manage their collective reproduction and their metabolic exchange with non-human nature. In less abstract terms, they are a kind of cell form for a new form of distributed democratic planning. You can think of them somewhat like Venezuela's communal system, which Meseros studied closely, as I mentioned earlier, albeit in a very different political context. I'm not going to, very, very different. So as the name suggests, PCPs are a subversion and an inversion of the failed model of public-private partnerships that I've just been describing, in which public money, land, and assets are given to the private sector or for-profit corporations to provide public goods and services. Over the years, public-private partnerships have ensured that private capital benefits massively from public funding, while the quality of services, infrastructure, and urban and rural landscapes have all precipitously declined across England and the UK. They are then a kind of instrument for the upwards redistribution of wealth and power. The fact that they're back on the agenda of this supposedly Labour government should be a cause of concern, but it's also an opportunity. So PCPs propose that rather than partnering with private capital, councils and other public bodies can and should partner with communities to design, manage, and expand the commons. They entail the co-production or the co-governance of an asset or a resource by three groups, right? One is relevant state authorities, such as council representatives or land-owning public bodies. This is the kind of public part of a PCP. The second is a commons association, which is comprised of community members and users of a resource or of industry. This forms part of the commons. And then there's those employed directly, the workers. So we have those, the workers are democratically in here, but not just the workers, because we know, there's work going on outside of the workplace to reproduce the workers, so you need to include reproductive work, unwaged work, workers from other parts of the community and sectors. The reason a joint enterprise would happen, a PCP would happen, the reason why a state might do this is that from the perspective of public authorities, the governance model helps mitigate the political risk of pursuing ambitious projects while addressing democratic deficits and reducing economic costs by enabling mutually supportive exchanges of finance, knowledge, and practice between the state and the commons. From the perspectives of workers and communities, this gives them access to finance, which they often need, or land very often, which they need and is hard for them to access without making some kind of a deal with the state. Okay, I'll wrap up a bit early because I know you've been listening for a long time, but the novelty of PCPs compared to other forms of community ownership lies in their power to set in motion what we call a self-expanding circuit of the commons to contest the self-expanding circuits of private capital accumulation. So revenue, profits, or knowledge accrued from one PCP can be used to start another PCP elsewhere in a virtuous circle of commoning and democratic governance. Profits from a community-owned energy company, for example, can be used to support the establishment of another or to reduce energy costs. That's quite a common model that exists all across Europe. But you could also use those funds to set up something like a community farm to try and decommodify food, or a food bank, right? And the idea is that by connecting these different spaces where community ownership is happening, you can kind of amplify each of them. So in the model, there's an A in the middle. If you take that as the first PCP or commons, it uses some of its funds to help B, or maybe some of its knowledge, and then B can help set up more and so on, right? You get this expansion. And the more it expands, the more it begins to contest through contested reproduction capital circuits of accumulation. That's kind of the model that we're working with. Okay. So finally, how do PCPs map onto, and if you want to talk about specific PCPs, I'm very happy to do that. Just ask questions and we'll talk about them in the Q&A. So how does it map onto this theory of transition that I started with? So the first is in response to Meseros, right, and these invariant features of capital's metabolic control. They seek to transfer democratic ownership and planning of production to workers and to communities. So in that way, in a limited form, but nevertheless, they aim to disalienate the associated producers from the means of production. That creates the potential, but only the potential, for a transition away from production to maximize exchange value towards production for the sake of need, or away from bullshit abundance and towards radical abundance. Second, by giving communities, rather than private or public sectors, ownership over the means of production, power is transferred from the state and capital to the associated producers. So in this respect, I draw inspiration from Stuart Hall's remarks in his essay, Socialism, The State, Socialism's Old Caretaker, about what he calls a partnership between the state and society. So we already had this name of public common partnerships before I found this quote, but then I found it and was like, every single talk I give, I'll use this. He goes, we can envisage a partnership between the state and society, by which he means workers, so long as the initiative is always passing to society, as long as the monopoly over the management of social life does not come to a dead halt with the state elite, so long as the state itself is rooted in and constantly draws energy from and is pushed actively by popular forces. So these are Meseros's invariant features. The three strategic challenges I spoke about, in using the surpluses from one PCP to support another, PCPs aim to insulate processes of commoning from the disciplinary effects of private investment. If you can get money, resources, whatever, from elsewhere in the commons, you don't need to go to a bank for a loan, so you don't need to pay off interest rates. That's a really basic way of doing this, right? So they don't have to pay back to private capital. So that's kind of contested reproduction. Through the struggle for PCPs and their management, we get new political subjects who are composed that understand that the commons is what they need to survive. We see this in all of the cases I'm working on. So in the Isle of Skye, they have community-owned hydropower, for example, right? And they understand that this is a common asset that they own and control, and they start to govern and think about themselves in a different way, simply because they have this shared asset base and resource. And then third and finally is just this constant awareness. These things take forever to set up. It's hard work. One day we think we've made an advance with a group community we're working with. The next day someone else comes into power and we lose the initiative that we had. Or someone moves out of a community who was an important organizer and we kind of have to go back to step one, right? So the linearity, the temporality of this change is always disrupted and uneven. Okay, that's 50 minutes. And I'm going to end with kind of like I usually try and end on like a go comrades. But we're talking about transition, and transition is hard, it's messy, I don't know the best way forward, right? And that kind of sense of unease, where the hell are we, what do we do together, that's the headspace you need to be in to think transition. So I'm just gonna leave with the kind of like, yeah, that. There you go.